The 1951 Accord, the day money changed masters. 1. The Quiet Revolution in a Smoke-Filled Room. In March 1951, in a Washington conference room that smelled like tobacco and tension, the U.S. government quietly redrew the map of modern money. It wasn't a treaty or a bailout, it was a handshake between the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve. The 1951 Fed Treasury Accord ended a wartime policy where the Fed kept interest rates low to help finance government debt. For the first time, the central bank claimed independence from the state it served. But independence, as it turned out, was a flexible word. The Fed got the power to raise rates, but not the freedom to escape politics. The Treasury got relief from inflation, but not from its addiction to cheap borrowing. It was less a divorce than a trial separation. So what does that actually mean? It means the Fed won the right to say no, just not too loudly. Footnote. The 1951 Accord symbolized monetary independence in theory but institutional cooperation in practice. 2. War, debt, and the printing press. During World War II, America borrowed more money than ever before, jumping from $49 billion to over $260 billion in just 4 years. The Fed promised to keep government borrowing cheap by buying bonds and pegging rates at low levels. The result was predictable: massive inflation and a government hooked on easy money. By 1950, inflation was rising again thanks to the Korean War. The Fed wanted to tighten policy. The Treasury wanted obedience. The two institutions, once partners, became rivals. And when President Truman summoned Fed officials to the White House, the meeting felt more like an ultimatum than a discussion. The Fed refused to surrender. The result? A truce disguised as reform. Footnote. Wartime monetary control created post-war inflation and a power struggle that forced a constitutional reckoning over economic sovereignty. 3. Independence, with a footnote. The 1951 Accord looked clean on paper. The Fed could set interest rates. The Treasury could issue debt. And both sides would cooperate to ensure stability. That last phrase was the catch. Cooperation meant coordination, and coordination meant the Fed was still expected to think like a Treasury ally. In other words, independence came with a leash. A long one, yes, but still a leash. Behind the press releases, the two institutions formed a secret joint body, the Treasury-Fed Policy Committee, to quietly align policy. It wasn't law, but it was power. Through it, the Fed learned to speak softly while moving markets. Footnote. The Post-Accord Cooperation Committee institutionalized behind-the-scenes coordination under the public myth of independence. 4. The Great Illusion of Control. In the decades that followed, independence became theater. Presidents from Kennedy to Johnson tried to steer the Fed without seeming to touch it. The Fed pretended to resist without fully breaking ranks. This covert coordination was the unspoken rule: act autonomous, align in practice. By the 1970s, the illusion cracked. Endless spending on Vietnam and social programs forced the Fed to print faster. Foreign nations, led by France, demanded gold in exchange for dollars. The gold reserves drained. Then in 1971, Nixon cut the link entirely. Gold was out. Fiat money was in. So what does that actually mean? It means the dollar was no longer backed by metal, but by confidence, caffeine, and hope. Footnote. The collapse of the gold standard exposed the fragility of independent monetary systems tethered to political demands. 5. The return of the punch bowl. In the 1980s, Paul Volcker restored faith in the Fed the hard way, by nearly breaking the economy. He raised interest rates above 20% to crush inflation, proving the central bank could still defy politics. The move sparked a deep recession but also cemented a new truth: credibility mattered more than popularity. From then on, every Fed chair inherited Volcker's ghost, the expectation to act tough, even when it hurt. The Treasury may have written checks, but the Fed now wrote the script. Footnote. Volcker's defiance redefined monetary legitimacy as the willingness to endure political pain to preserve systemic trust. 6. The Fed put in the merging of money and power. After Volcker, Alan Greenspan built the opposite kind of empire, one of comfort. Whenever markets stumbled, the Fed cut rates. The Fed put was born, the belief that the central bank would always rescue Wall Street. Independence became dependence again, just in reverse. By 2008, the Treasury and the Fed were back in sync, jointly rescuing the financial system. By 2020, during the pandemic, they merged balance sheets. The separation that began in 1951 had quietly evaporated. So what does that actually mean? The Fed is now independent the same way your shadow is independent, it only moves when you do. Footnote. Post-2008 policy blurred fiscal and monetary roles, creating a de facto merger of crisis management functions. 7. The theater of confidence. The most overlooked legacy of the Accord wasn't policy, it was psychology. For the first time, the Fed began managing expectations as much as interest rates. Forward guidance, press conferences, and Fed speak became its real weapons. The system learned that money isn't just printed, it's believed. And belief, once broken, is the hardest currency to restore. Footnote. Modern monetary governance relies on managing narrative confidence rather than enforcing mechanical restraint. 8. The eternal truce. 70 years later, the 1951 handshake still echoes. Every Fed rate hike, every Treasury auction, every market tremor is part of the same dance. Independence is conditional. Cooperation is permanent. Control is an illusion both sides agree to maintain. Because in truth, no one runs the system alone. They run it together, or not at all. So what does that actually mean? It means the real power of money lies not in who holds it, but in who believes in it. Footnote. The Fed-Treasury dynamic remains a perpetual balancing act between credibility, politics, and collective belief.